How is everybody? Good. Me too. And in Ipoh, you guys, how are you? That's a little awkward, but that's okay. As it concerns Nipawa, there's a rewind button. So you can actually just hit that button, and I'll get Jed to go back and edit it out, and we have before, because Nipawa is a week behind us on this feed, and so anything that is particularly embarrassing or confusing, we just take out. It's a fantastic feature to have. Don't you wish your life had it? Some of us are wounded because there is no rewind button. And almost immediately we know what moments we'd go back to. If it was just a matter of edit, cut, paste, move, delete, start again. But we're wounded. And we can't do that, and we know we can't do that. In this series, we've been looking at the wounds that we have, and we've been saying that when somebody comes along and says, "Me too," so they're wounded in the same way, there's help there. It's empathy, but there's a help that's available in Jesus who comes, who's actually healed. He's not bleeding beside us. He is scarred, but he's healed. And when he comes with his scars, he doesn't just empathize with us. He gives us victory. We've been working with this theme for a few weeks, and then last week I came across this quote that basically nails it. No suffering human being is helped by somebody telling them they have the same problem. It's Henry Nouwen. You can Google him, fascinating life, Catholic priest, beautiful writer about how to grow spiritually when you're wounded, which is like for all of us, right? So in this series, we have seen Jesus come and help with shame and jealousy and control. And today, we're going to see him come to somebody in the worst moment of their life, a moment that they wish they could rewind back to. Some of the moments that we wish we could rewind back to, they're not super poignant for us. I was thinking about some of the things that I wish I could hit the button and go back to. One is just simply Bitcoin. I wish that 3 years ago when somebody said, "Hey, we should buy some Bitcoin," I said, "Sure, here's $100 of mine." That would be however many thousands now. So we've got these low-level regrets, but there's also regrets that we have where, wow, if I had never actually turned left and went and introduced myself to that person, then all of this stuff would never have been unleashed on me. Or if I could just go back and just say it differently, because I think that was when the seeds that absolutely started ripping apart our marriage, I think that's when I planted them. Or we wish we could go back with our kids, or we wish we could go back, and there's a sense like, we cannot get back there. And even if, and this is the hard part, I think, say you did something before you came to know Christ, or maybe even in your journey with Christ, and it hurt somebody, but then, like, Jesus helped you, and you got better, you got fixed, but the mess that you made never gets touched. And so you've got this weird thing that you, from your place of healing, are looking back at this thing that you're going, I did that. Friends, what we're doing is talking about the worst moments in our lives and what Jesus would do if he was meeting us there. To do that, we're going to look at King David, at the worst moment in his life. To get there, though, to understand the depth and the pain and the anguish of this moment of his, we have to trace quite a few years, probably decades, because his worst moment in his life probably isn't the one he regrets. It's not the one he wants to go rewind back to. Who would want to rewind back to that? He wants to rewind decades earlier to the place where he hit the first domino that went tick, 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 and ended with a massive anguish moment. So here's where it all starts, as near as we can tell in Scripture. King David, having consolidated the kingdom and enjoying what seems like peace, or at least what passes for peace when you're a king in a militant regime, is on his balcony. And he looks out over the city, he sees a naked woman, and he wants her. He's a king, so he takes her. invites her to his chambers, sleeps with her, she gets pregnant. This causes a huge problem. Not just the awkwardness of this royal scandal, but she's married to one of his faithful soldiers, to one of his mighty men. And so he has to arrange the scheme by which he murders Uriah, is her husband's name. And he has multiple days where he can decide, I'm not actually going to kill this man, I'm going to come clean. And he never actually takes that. You know how sometimes in the moment you can have like passionate murder and then there's like the cold-blooded variety? This is the cold-blooded variety. Calculating, methodical. Uriah dies. A few years later, one of David's sons, Amnon, and David more or less gets away with it. A few years later, one of David's sons, Amnon, takes a liking to one of his half-sisters. Seems weird to us in ways it wouldn't in ancient culture. He's got a thing for his half-sister. And by a thing, it's like a twisted, devourous, lecherous, lustful thing. He wants her so badly. He's scheming to try and get her. He's complaining about how he wants her. He can't seem to make it work. So he's got a buddy who sets it up for him. He's like, pretend to be sick, get her to come and feed you some food, and then basically in that moment you can dismiss your sermons and you can just take her. And he does, despite her pleading, despite the disgrace. He forces himself on her, and she is now, in that culture, sort of set aside, and she basically, it sounds like she lives the rest of her days out in the basement, so to speak, just kind of shamed. She does that in the basement of her brother Absalom's house. Now, Absalom and everybody else is watching, waiting for King David to do something about what Amnon just did. But if you're King David, what kind of moral ground do you feel that you're standing on when it comes to dealing with sexual sin? Pretty shaky. And so David gets angry, but he does nothing. And Absalom, who's got his sister Tamar in the basement, wrecked and ruined from the violent aggression of Amnon, begins to seethe at the lack of injustice. And a few years later, he hatches his plan. Brings all the king's sons together for a feast, and there, as they're eating together, he falls on and he kills his half-brother Amnon. Here, David steps in sort of a lukewarm way. He should be administering like fierce justice over this murder. But again, what kind of moral ground is David standing on when it comes to murder? Pretty shaky. So Absalom has to just be exiled. He's not allowed back near David. Absalom gets frustrated and angry. He's got ambitions of his own, kept away from the royal court. He can't realize those. He starts to connive to get closer and closer to David. Eventually, they sort of reconcile. It's this thing where, yeah, okay, you're allowed here, but I'm still not coming to family gatherings. You're still not allowed to see my face, but we're formally reconciled. No relational connection, and then eventually Absalom gets his attention by lighting all his fields on fire, and they appear to reconcile, but by then it's way too far gone. And Absalom starts sitting at the gate of the city. And when people come in to see the king, he does this casual little, hey, where are you going? Oh, you're going to see my dad? Oh, he's probably not going to be able to see you. And even if he does, he's not so good at administering justice anyway. If I was king, here's what I'd do. Hey, nice talking to you. And off they go. The next day, hey, where are you going? And the text actually says he begins to turn the hearts of the people away from his father and to him. Eventually, because he's keeping track, he realizes he could actually make a go of taking the throne. And so he acts, and he sends people out in all directions saying, Absalom has been anointed king. David hears about it. David has to flee. David's been betrayed by his closest advisor who goes to help Absalom and has given him advice. And so David has all these people that used to eat at his table are now turning against him. Totally betrayed. And off he goes with his men around him, and they regroup, and eventually it builds strategically until there's this battle. And it's that battle we're going to read about, and it's this chapter that takes us to the worst moment of David's life. 2 Samuel 18. David now mustered the men who were with him and appointed generals and captains to lead them. He sent the troops out in 3 groups, placing one under Joab, another under Joab's brother Abishai, son of Zeruiah, and one under Ittai, the man from Gath. The king told his troops, "I'm going out with you." But his men objected strongly. You don't go, they urged. "If we have to turn and run, even if half of us die, it'll make no difference to Absalom's troops. They're looking only for you. You're worth 10,000 of us, and it's better that you stay here in the town and send help if we need it." King agrees with that wise counsel. "If you think that's the best plan, I'll do it," the king answered. So he stood alongside the gate of the town as all the troops marched out in groups of hundreds and of thousands. And the king gave this command to Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, the generals. Kind of motions them over, and it seems like he whispers it, but we'll see. Clearly it's loud enough that it's not just for them. "For my sake, deal gently with young Absalom." So you've got this betrayed father who's still a father, saying, if we catch the boy, don't hurt him. The next verse says, all the troops heard the king give this order to his commanders. It's going to really inspire the troops. Fight hard, but not too hard. So the battle began in the forest of Ephraim, and the Israelites' troops were beaten back by David's men. This is fascinating to read this. You've got this old bear of a warrior in David and his grizzled warriors, and they kind of use this old man strength to inflict a beating on the young ones. It's great slaughter that day. 20,000 men laid down their lives. The battle raged all across the countryside, and more men died because of the forest than were killed by the sword. That's a mesmerizing line to me, actually. We don't have a ton of time for it, but more men died because of the forest, because of the sword. There's a few places in Scripture where creation reveals that it's on God's side in interesting ways. During the battle, Absalom happened to come upon some of David's men. He tried to escape on his mule, but as he rode beneath the thick branches of a great tree, his hair got caught in the tree. This is a fluke, but if you've ever mountain biked for any length of time, you can kind of understand how this might happen. A branch goes through your helmet, and suddenly you've got a little bit of whiplash, and you're going, wow, I'm glad my strap has a blow-off thing, right? It'll pop off, or the branch was not that strong. Not so with Absalom's hair. He gets caught in the tree. This man is like a walking Rogaine commercial. Thick, luscious locks. Caught in the tree, so much so that he's dangling. One of David's men came and saw what happened, and he's so stuck, they're not worried about him getting away. This is kind of the crazy thing. He's like, oh, there's Absalom, and he walks away. Tells Job, I saw Absalom dangling from a great tree. What? Job demanded. You saw him there and didn't kill him? This is the guy that David whispered in his ear, hey, psst, don't hurt him. Or I guess said loudly enough for other people to hear. But Job should know. I would have rewarded you with 10 pieces of silver and a hero's belt. I wouldn't kill the king's son for 1,000 pieces of silver, the man replied to Job. We all heard the king say to you and Abishai and Ittai, for my sake, please spare young Absalom. And if I'd betrayed the king by killing his son, and the king would certainly find out who did it, you yourself would be the first to abandon me. Enough of this nonsense, Job says. Then he took 3 daggers, plunges them into Absalom's heart as he dangled still alive in the great tree. At that point, 10 of Job's young armor-bearers surround Absalom and kill him. Then Job blew the ram's horn, and his men returned from chasing the army of Israel. There's no point in fighting. You've got the main guy, right? They kept David back because they knew if David died, the war is over. If Absalom dies, the war is over. They threw Absalom's body into a deep pit in the forest, piled a great heap of stones on it. All of Israel fled to their homes. So David doesn't know any of this yet. They send a series of messengers to him that you can read about in the verses between 18 and 29, is roughly where I've skipped. Now in 29, the messenger's there, and David asks him, what about young Absalom? The king demanded, is he all right? Ahimaaz replied, when Job told me to come, there was a lot of commotion, but I didn't know what was happening. So the first messenger gets a little scared to tell the king. Wait here, the king told him. So Ahimaaz stepped aside. Then the next messenger comes from Ethiopia. I have good news for my lord the king. Today the Lord has rescued you from all those who rebelled against you. What about young Absalom? The king demanded. Is he all right? And the Ethiopian replied very diplomatically, May all of your enemies, my Lord the King, both now and in the future, share the fate of that young man. The king was overcome with emotion. He went up to the room over the gateway and burst into tears. As he went, he cried, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son, Absalom, if only I died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." This is the worst day of David's life. In that phrase, "Oh, my son Absalom, Absalom, my son Absalom," is so much. There's the betrayal. This is the guy who you sat at the table with. You rolled your eyes at the inside jokes that you had about your brothers. This is the son who was charismatic like you. He knew how to lead people. He could draw people. He had so much, and he betrayed you, and so there's pain. And then there's just the loss of little Absalom. There's the smell of a son when you're holding him like this, showing him how to shoot a bow. Probably similar when you're showing him how to play a harp. When you're telling him stories about when you were a kid and you killed a giant, Absalom gets so excited he can't fall asleep. Oh, my son, my son. And then piling on top of all that pain, all those memories, all those sights, all those smells, is the very real truth. This is all my fault. Oh, my son, if only I had died instead of you. David here maybe not just wanting to swap his life, but actually take his life, wishing he was dead, because he's going to live a long time now. And there's nothing about this that he can fix, ever. And it's into that moment that the Son of God, Jesus Christ, comes. And he taps David on the shoulder and he says, "Me too." And David says, "You too." "Yeah, me too. I know betrayal." There was a whole bunch of young men who wanted to spend time with me, and I chose one to be one of the 12. And his name was Judas. And Judas came with me for 3 years, and we ate together and we laughed together. Judas had a basket full of bread that never ran out, and he just walked around and he kept handing out bread, and it never was emptied. And then he did the same with fish, and then he gathered it up, and there was more beforehand. Judas saw me put sight in the eyes of a blind man. I trusted him so much, I put him in charge of our money. And then he sold me for like 2 paychecks. Sold me like a slave to my torturers. So no, I understand betrayal, David. Now, David didn't get to where he is by not going the distance with God. So that's not enough for David. You read the Psalms and you understand David didn't shy away from going all the way into the depths of his heart. And so he says, "Jesus, yes, for sure, except that it's not family." There's a special pain that comes when there's a betrayal from family. And Jesus says, "Okay, let me get you this book. It's called the Bible. And you're going to be in it someday. But for now, let me read you some words that I said just before I died." And Jesus turns to Matthew 27:46. And he says that about 3 o'clock, Jesus called out with a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you abandoned me? My Father, why have you abandoned me?" And in that phrase, Well, that resonates with David. My God, my son, Absalom, Father. All the anguish, all the pain that's loaded in David's phrase is in that other phrase. And Jesus starts to share his memories of the presence of the Father, of the strength of God. I was just a little shaver, says Jesus, and my mom told me about the stories around my birth, and I felt this surge in me of the presence of God. And we were in the temple, and I felt it again. God was so near to me, and I began to teach. And then when I was baptized, the dove came down, and I heard the voice saying, "This is my son." And I felt strength. And then the first time, I didn't even know really what was going to happen, but my mom pushed me into the corner. She said, "Turn the water into wine. They're out of wine." And I prayed, and I asked, and I felt the surge of God's presence in me. And when they poured that jug of water and it came out wine, I rejoiced inside. And then they lowered a man in front of me. And I prayed, and I felt the surge of strength in me, and I said, "Your sins are forgiven." And then I looked around the room, and I said, "And just in case you think I can't do that, get up and walk." And it happened. And it continued to happen. There was a little girl, and she was dead, and I felt the surge of strength of the Spirit of God, His presence in me, and I held her hand, and I said, "Little girl, get up." And I felt the power go from me to her, and she got up. Another time I was just walking, and I felt the strength of God in me, and somebody touched me, and I felt the power go, and I said, "Who did that?" And she was healed just by reaching out to me. And then I realized His strength for me was also for other people, and I sent out my disciples. And Judas went out, and Judas casted out a demon, and he came back and said, "Lord, even the demons respond to your name when we use it." Near the end of my life, I could literally just stand outside of a tomb. So close was the Father to me, so full was His strength in me that I just said, "Lazarus, come out." And a man 3 days dead walked out of the tomb. So clearly it was all building to something, David. So clearly there was a magnificent moment coming. But in that moment, he was nowhere to be found. Absolute abandonment, absolute betrayal. My Father nowhere in sight. My God, why have you forsaken me? Betrayal. David did not get where he is by stopping short of going into the depths of his heart. And he's got one more level. He says, "Jesus, yes, except you got to die. You had the moment of abandonment, and then you didn't have to live with it. I got another couple decades left of looking at this pain. You got to die. I'm stuck here." And Jesus looks at David and says, "Do I look dead to you? Or do I look all the more alive for having been dead?" And perhaps David, when what has been lost to you comes back to you in its purest form, will you not love it and appreciate it more than if it had never been taken from you? And at that point, David just loses his frame of reference for how to process these things, and it's at that point that Jesus stops talking to him and He talks to us, because we're on this side of the cross and we're on this side of the empty grave, and we have the Spirit. So He can say things to us that He couldn't say to David, and here's what He says to you if you're His brother, if you're His sister. He says, "The same things that God did for me, He is going to do for you." You will be more fully alive for having died. You will be scarred, and so you will remember the wounds, because who wants to forget, really, some of the things that we've lost? We don't want to forget, we just don't want to hurt anymore. You will be scarred, you will remember, but you will not hurt. We say, Jesus, how? And Jesus says to you, as far as you're concerned, there's no rewind button. I'm the master of time. I have buttons to push that you can't even imagine. Simply because I have reduced myself so that I'm small enough and accessible to you, never forget who I am. I master time. I created time. I skit back and forth across linear time, making it dance. I can fix everything with creative, mind-blowing beauty in a way that leaves everybody universally satisfied. And you will never see it coming, though you'll be blessed by it. In faith, may you never forget that I am the Alpha and the Omega. I am the beginning and I am the end. I am. And so by faith, those of us who are Jesus' brothers and sisters, we wait for those magnificent surprises that are surely coming. When the things that have been taken from us, the things that we think will wound us forever, come back so beautifully transformed at His hand in unfathomable ways. And we understand that when He says, I will wipe every tear from their eyes, that's omni-tense, not past tense. I will wipe. I am wiping. I'm going to wipe. It's omni-tense. Every tear, every eye. And in the meantime, so you know I'm not making this up, says Jesus, I give you my Spirit. And on your best days, you'll taste that future with such strength that you'll know it's inevitable. And on your worst days, there will still be enough of me to hold you through. And I give you my blood, and I give you my body today as I did on the night when I was betrayed. I'm going to invite the band forward and invite you forward to take the bread and take the cup.